In October 1911, a Mr. E.C. Hunt traveled from Cookstown to Toronto to give testimony before Sir William Meredith's Royal Commission on Workmen's Compensation Laws. Mr. Hunt was the Royal Commission's first witness.
Last year I lost my right arm in a sawmill in Cookstown, and I received no compensation whatever for my loss. My wages stopped as soon as my arm was cut off, and I had to make whatever provision I could to enable me to get better. Since getting better and getting an artificial arm, I have had great trouble in getting employment of any description.
In the early 1980s, the Ontario government proposed amendments to the Workmen's Compensation Act that would have fundamentally altered the benefits system. Injured workers, like Emilio Scardino, a member of the Executive Committee of the Union of Injured Workers, appeared before the Standing Committee charged with discussing and making recommendations on the proposed amendments.
Up to now, we have been considered professional demonstrators, agitators, you name it. That's the way they have considered us and called us. Up to now, we've been treated like things, not like men, like machines, that they are good as long as they work, and they are good as long as they can produce. Once they get hurt, they can be scrapped, put on the list of welfare, and so on. But the injured workers for years have said, we are injured workers, and we want to get back to the productive force.
Beryl Brown came to Canada from Jamaica in 1992. She got a factory job as a drill press operator. By 1997, she was experiencing pain from repetitive strain injury so severe that she could no longer work at her job. Her employer denied that her injury was work-related, and the Workers' Compensation Board refused her claim.
I feel sometimes as if I'm in a shell, like a little nut in a shell. Because it's so hard. You don't want to burden down people and complain about pain. You don't want to, and they don't understand sometimes. They're tired of you to complain, pain. And only if they had paid me my money, I would have taken care of my body. My health wouldn't reach this far. I would be at the company working today if they had given me the right medical care. Maybe I would be there, who knows? Maybe I would be in a bit better field too, or a different field. So I wouldn't be sitting here today in this kind of agony. So they made my condition worse by not paying me my money, by not allowing me to good medical care.
These are the words of three injured workers spoken almost a century apart. Words that are particular to that person's story, yet which have much in common. In varying ways, they speak of loss, regret, frustration, anger, physical and emotional pain. The history of injured workers in Ontario is, unfortunately, overflowing with similar stories. But resistance and collective struggles for dignity and justice also characterize their history. There is no one place to begin this story, no single moment in time where one can say, yes, that is where the story of injured workers in Ontario begins. Canada's Industrial Revolution, which had begun in the 1860s, by the end of the 1890s was characterized by a rapid growth of ever larger steam-powered factories. Young boys and girls worked alongside their mothers and fathers in rolling and textile mills, and in sweatshops where clothes were sewn together for large manufacturers and retailers. Hours were long, in many cases 10 to 12 per day. The machinery was typically unguarded and dangerous, the air dusty and toxic. Construction workers engaged in back-breaking labor. These workplaces were accidents waiting to happen. A Factory Act passed in 1885 provided minimal protections to a small number of workers. The Workmen's Compensation for Injuries Act, passed in 1886, had its origins in an increasing number of railway accidents where the cause for concern was injury to passengers, not workers. And that law was not really a workmen's compensation law. Rather, it was more properly an employer's liability law, a law that almost completely shielded employers from the social, economic, and political impact of hazardous and unhealthy workplaces. For if an employer could demonstrate that the injured worker knew the risks and voluntarily accepted them, or that the accident was caused by a fellow worker, or that the worker had contributed in some way to the accident and subsequent injury, then he could not be found liable. An explosion at the Hamilton Powder Company in Cumminsville, Ontario, on October 9, 1884, is a tragic example of this law in action. 5 workers died in this explosion. An inquest found the employer liable, and one of the widows was awarded $2,000. The employer lost an appeal to the Court of the Queen's Bench, but won on a higher appeal to the Ontario Court of Appeals, the judge ruling that neither the company nor its director could be found liable for the negligence of the manager. The widow lost her award of $2,000. As the 19th century came to a close, there were growing pressures to change these laws. One pressure point came in the form of a dramatic 300% increase in the number of accidents between 1900 and 1904. Workplace injuries were now an individual circumstance with growing societal impact. For a number of reasons, including perhaps a heightened sense that it was the conditions of work and not the so-called careless worker that was the root cause of this increase in accidents, injured workers began winning their liability cases in the courts. Another push for change came from trade unionists. Ontario Unionists had been demanding better working conditions since the early 1870s, when they organized the 9-hours-day movement, the basis of which was the desire to live safer, healthier, and longer lives. In the early 1900s, the craft unions, stonemasons, molders, machinists, and running trades workers, began agitating in earnest for changes to the compensation laws. They even had a political ally in Allen Studholme, a Hamilton stove mounter who had been elected to the legislature in 1906 and became a champion of workmen's compensation reform. Altogether, the 1900s were a time of economic, social, and political unrest. In time-honored Canadian fashion, the Ontario government of Sir James Whitney asked Chief Justice Sir William Meredith to conduct a royal commission into the workmen's compensation laws in Canada and around the world. Appointed on June 10, 1910, Meredith took the task before him as seriously as he took his time doing it. Altogether, Meredith held 27 sittings where he listened to workers, unionists, employers, insurance, and government officials. Mostly, though, Meredith heard from two men, Fred Bancroft, Vice President of the Dominion Trades and Labor Congress, and Frank W. Weganast, a lawyer hired by the Canadian Manufacturers Association to present their case and represent their interests. As it turned out, Meredith heard primarily from Weganast. While workers and employers agreed on the need for new legislation, a law that would get rid of what Meredith called
this nuisance of litigation,
they did not agree on what the new law should contain. Should workers give up their right to sue?
Who would pay?
Should there be a waiting period?
how to finance, current cost or capitalization,
Private or public?
An individual or collective liability system?
How long to pay benefits for permanent disability?
Near the end of the Royal Commission, there was agreement only on a public, state-managed system. It was left to Meredith to decide on the other issues. In his draft act, issued near the end of the hearings, Meredith eliminated workers' right to sue their employers. In return, he believed workers deserved guaranteed access to fair compensation, at benefit levels, he stated, that were
not less than a mess of pottage.
Meredith rejected employer arguments that workers should contribute directly to the compensation system, agreeing with labor that injured workers already paid by virtue of their injuries, which cut into their capacities to earn a decent living, and who were to suffer the physical and emotional effects of their injuries for the rest of their lives. Meredith opted for both collective and individual liability. Finally, Meredith recommended a current cost system. In examining Meredith's draft act and his final report, it is evident that he accepted more of the worker unionist arguments than those of employers. Why? Because justice demanded it. And, importantly, to keep injured workers from falling into poverty and becoming a financial burden on their families and society. But why pay injured workers for as long as their disabilities lasted? In his final report, Meredith wrote,
To limit the period during which the compensation is to be paid, regardless of the duration of the disability, as is done by the laws of some countries, is, in my opinion, not only inconsistent with the principle upon which a true compensation law is based, but unjust to the injured workman, for the reason that, if the disability continues beyond the prescribed period, he will be left with his impaired earning power, or if he is totally disabled, without any earning power, at a time when his need of receiving compensation will presumably be greater than at the time he was injured, to become a burden upon his relatives or friends or upon the community.
Meredith, a former leader of the Ontario Conservative Party, was also very aware of the political temper of the times. He understood that real change was needed to bring some justice to the system of workmen's compensation and to establish a political calm.
Half measures, which mitigate but do not remove injustice, are, in my judgment, to be avoided. That the existing law inflicts injustice on the working man is admitted by all.
Ontario business interests strongly opposed many of the features of Meredith's draft act. Labor feared that the government would cave into such pressure and mounted a spirited campaign in support of Meredith and his vision of workmen's compensation. When the Workmen's Compensation Act was passed in April 1914, The industrial banner proclaimed that it represented a new page in the history of Ontario. Meredith's views notwithstanding, it was clear when the Workmen's Compensation Act was proclaimed into law that injured workers and labor unions did not get everything they had set out to win. Workers lost their right to sue their employers. Certain key industries and occupations, such as agricultural workers and domestic and retail workers, were not included in the Act. This meant that those jobs where women worked in the majority were not covered. Railway workers fell under the Act, but under Schedule 2, there was great concern that their employers would contest each and every claim. Occupational diseases could be found at the end of the Act, but only 6 were listed. Finally, compensation payments were limited to 55% of wages, not the 100% labor had asked for. While there were shortcomings in the 1915 Act, many of its provisions represented real gains, victories for injured workers. As Eric Tucker, professor of law at Osgoode Hall Law School, recounts,
prior to 1914, it was extremely difficult for workers to get compensation from their employers through lawsuits. It's against that background that the 1914 Workers' Compensation Act was such a great victory. For the first time, workers could get compensation without having to prove that their employers were at fault, without having to go through the lengthy and costly litigation process in courts, and also the Act established the principle that as a matter of social justice, employers were required to pay compensation to injured workers.
The Act was, then, important for the principles upon which it was based.
Compensation as long as the disability lasts.
The system was based fundamentally on the notion of the collective liability of employers.
Employers would pay for the system.
The question of who was at fault for an accident was no longer an issue.
The Workmen's Compensation Board would be autonomous,
independent of the government and the winds of political change.
Non-adversarial.
Over the decades, these principles have come to be known as Meredith's principles.